In the previous section, we examined the characteristics of a bona fide purchaser and how good faith, valuable consideration, and lack of notice determine lawful ownership in Arizona real estate. Now we shift from the perspective of the innocent buyer to the more complex scenarios where fairness and voluntariness are compromised. Real estate contracts, like all contracts, require that parties enter into them freely, knowingly, and without deception. When factors such as duress, undue influence, misrepresentation, or fraud are present, a contract may be rendered void, voidable, or unenforceable under Arizona law. Understanding these concepts is essential for licensees. As brokers and agents have an affirmative duty under Commissioner's Rule R428-1101 to protect the public from unethical or dishonest conduct. Duress occurs when one party is forced or threatened into signing a contract against their will. Under Arizona law, contracts made under duress are voidable because true consent or mutual assent does not exist. Duress can take the form of physical threats, financial coercion, or wrongful pressure that deprives an individual of free will. For example, if a seller agrees to transfer property because a buyer threatens to publicly release damaging personal information, that contract would be unenforceable due to duress. The Arizona Supreme Court, in U.S. Life Title Co. of Arizona v. Gutkin, 1983, stated that consent obtained through wrongful threats or intimidation lacks legal validity. In real estate transactions, duress undermines the voluntary nature of agreement and invalidates mutual consent. One of the essential elements discussed in the previous section, undue influence, differs from duress in that it involves persuasion rather than force. It occurs when one party exerts excessive pressure or manipulates another's trust to secure an agreement that benefits the influencer. The victim's judgment is overpowered through dependency, confidence, or emotional control. A common example arises in transactions involving elderly sellers who are pressured by family members or caretakers to sell property at an unfair price. Arizona courts have held that contracts resulting from undue influence are voidable because they violate the principle of voluntary and informed consent. To prevent such situations, brokers should ensure that all parties understand the transaction fully and that no party appears coerced or manipulated. In Stewart v. Woodruff, Arizona's Appears 1982, the court found that undue influence existed where one party took advantage of another's weakened mental state to acquire property below market value. Misrepresentation involves false statements or omissions of material facts that induce another party to enter a contract. In Arizona, misrepresentation may be either innocent, negligent, or fraudulent, depending on the intent behind the act. An innocent misrepresentation occurs when a false statement is made without knowledge of its falsity, while a negligent misrepresentation arises when a person fails to exercise reasonable care in verifying information. Fraudulent misrepresentation, however, involves deliberate deceit. For example, if a seller knowingly conceals termite damage or a roof leak, intending to mislead the buyer, this constitutes fraudulent misrepresentation. Such actions not only void a contract, but can also lead to civil liability under Hill v. Jones, Arizona Appears 1986, where the court ruled that sellers have a duty to disclose material defects known to them that are not readily observable by the buyer. Fraud in real estate extends beyond misrepresentation and encompasses any intentional deception that results in a party giving up money, rights, or property. Fraud may involve falsified documents, forged signatures, or deceptive representations about title, ownership, or encumbrances. Under ARS, paragraph 33-420, recording a false or forged document is a criminal offense, and victims may recover damages. An example of fraud would be a person forging a quitclaim deed to transfer property they do not own. The innocent purchaser may later lose title, as fraud voids the fraudulent conveyance even against subsequent good faith buyers. if the defect is discovered. Fraud undermines the integrity of the real estate market and is vigorously prosecuted both civilly and criminally in Arizona. Real estate professionals have a duty to recognize warning signs of duress, undue influence, misrepresentation, or fraud during transactions. Commissioner's Rule R428-1101A requires licensees to protect and promote the client's interests while dealing honestly with all parties. If a broker suspects that a client is acting under pressure or that material facts are being concealed, they must disclose these concerns to the parties involved or withdraw from representation if necessary. A licensee who knowingly facilitates a fraudulent transaction can face disciplinary action under ARS, paragraph 32 to 153, including license suspension or revocation. Consider a practical example. A widow selling her late husband's property agrees to an unreasonably low sale price after being pressured by her son-in-law, who claims she cannot afford the taxes. The listing agent, observing her distress, proceeds with the sale without verifying her understanding of the transaction. If the agent had intervened, obtained an independent appraisal, or encouraged legal counsel, the sale might have been prevented. In this case, the sale could later be rescinded for undue influence, and the broker could face disciplinary consequences for failing to protect the client's interests. Discussion. How does duress affect the enforceability of a real estate contract? Answer. A contract signed under duress is voidable because it lacks true consent. The agreement was obtained through threats, coercion, or intimidation rather than free will. What distinguishes undue influence from duress in real estate transactions? Answer. Undue influence relies on manipulation or exploitation of trust rather than overt threats or force, often involving emotional or psychological pressure that overcomes a person's independent judgment. What duties do real estate professionals have when misrepresentation or fraud is suspected? Answer. They must act with honesty, disclose material information, and avoid facilitating deceptive practices. Failure to do so can lead to civil liability and disciplinary action by the Arizona Department of Real Estate. Review summary. Contracts obtained through duress, undue influence, misrepresentation, or fraud undermine the foundational principles of consent and fairness that define enforceable agreements. Arizona law provides strong protections for parties coerced or deceived into transactions, allowing contracts to be voided when free will or honest dealing is absent. Duress involves threats or coercion. Undue influence involves manipulation of trust. Misrepresentation involves false or omitted material statements, and fraud involves intentional deceit or forgery. Real estate licensees play a critical role in preventing these abuses by adhering to the Commissioner's rules of honesty and due care, ensuring that every transaction reflects genuine agreement and transparency. Landmark cases such as Hill versus Jones, Stewart versus Woodruff, and U.S. Life Title Co. of Arizona versus Gutkin reaffirm Arizona's commitment to protecting consumers from unethical or coercive practices in real estate.